Two families, 30 years. One love that could end the war. TRUCE. A novel. Blood drew the line. Love might be the only thing that can erase it. Chapter 1. Mercedes. The church at the dead end of Lincoln Avenue had buried more of the neighborhood than anywhere else on earth, and Mercedes Davenport knew every crack in its stained glass by heart. She sat in the third pew from the front, spine straight, hands folded in her lap, the way her father had taught her, before she was old enough to understand why a girl needed to learn how to sit like she wasn't afraid. Today it was Laquan Williams they were burying, 19 years old, Black Star family, shot 2 blocks from the barber shop his granddaddy used to own. Mercedes hadn't known him well. She knew his face from cookouts, knew his mother's crying now the way she'd known his mother's laughing before. Reverend Thomas Wallace stood at the pulpit with the particular stillness of a man who had done this too many times to still be surprised by it, though never so many times that it stopped costing him something. His voice didn't rise. It never rose. He'd learned, same as everybody on this street had learned, that grief didn't need volume. It needed room. Across the aisle, on the other side of the church, the way the two families had unofficially divided even holy ground, Mercedes could feel Jace's presence without looking at him. He sat the way Willie D. sat, the stillness of men who had buried too, who understood exactly what this room cost. Her father sat beside her, jaw tight, staring straight ahead at the casket, like he was doing math in his head. Mercedes knew the math. 2 sons. This was somebody else's son today, but her father counted every funeral against his own ledger, and she'd watched him do it since she was 12 years old. Since Rayshawn. She didn't need to turn her head to know when Jace looked their way. She felt her father shift, almost imperceptibly, the smallest correction of posture, spine straighter, shoulders square, like a man bracing without knowing he was bracing. Then the smallest nod, not friendship, not truce. Just 2 old men acknowledging in a language older than either of their organizations that the room held only fathers today, and the war could wait outside the doors. Mercedes had seen that nod her whole life. She used to think it meant something was almost breaking open between them. She'd stopped believing that around the time they lowered Devon into the ground. After, on the steps, the 2 families filtered out in their separate directions like water finding separate paths around the same rock. Black Star toward the west end of Lincoln, Diamond Mafia toward the east, and nobody had to be told which way to walk. It was choreography so old, nobody remembered learning it. Mercedes lingered a moment longer than she needed to, watching the Diamond Mafia crowd break apart across the street. That was when she saw him, not looking at her, looking at his phone, thumb moving fast over the screen in a way that didn't match the black suit or the neighborhood he stood in. Jace's son, Neef. She knew his face the way she knew all their faces, cataloged since childhood, the way you learn to recognize weather patterns that might one day flood your house. He looked up like he'd felt her watching. For a second, across Lincoln Avenue, across 30 years of blood, neither of them looked away. Then Big Terry's hand was at her elbow, steering her toward the car, murmuring something about the family needing to get back before the repast, and the moment closed like a door nobody had opened on purpose. Neef. Neef Carter. Nobody had called him Jace Jr. since middle school, when he'd made it clear with his fists that the name died with his childhood, stood on the east side of Lincoln Avenue in a suit that itched at the collar, watching his father shake hands with men who'd buried people same as they had, and thought about the 17 browser tabs open on his laptop back home. He shouldn't have been thinking about that. Not here. Not with Laquan Williams in the ground an hour ago, and his father's face doing that thing it did at funerals. A stillness that Neef had learned young was not calm, was actually its opposite, was a man holding a door shut with both hands. But his mind went where it went, and right now it was running through a half-finished model he'd built at 2 a.m, something that could predict foot traffic patterns from old surveillance footage, something that had absolutely no application to anything, except that it had kept his hands busy and his brain quiet for 4 hours when sleep wouldn't come. He didn't know why he built things like that. He only knew that when he was deep in code, deep in the logic of it, he wasn't Jace's son. He wasn't Diamond Mafia. He was just a mind solving a problem, and problems didn't care what block you grew up on. He hadn't told anybody about the computer stuff. Not Lil Chris, who'd known him since they were 7 and would clown him mercilessly, lovingly, mercilessly. Neef could already hear it. "Nigga, you out here trying to be Bill Gates." And Neef didn't have the stomach for that today, or most days. Only Imani knew. His sister called every Sunday at 8, like clockwork, from wherever she was living now. Atlanta, last he'd heard. And she was the only person who'd ever heard him talk about it and not laughed. Not once.
"You should tell somebody,"
she'd said last week.
"Not to prove anything. Just so you're not carrying it by yourself."
He hadn't answered that. Some things you kept in the dark, not because you were ashamed of them, but because the light might reveal how much you needed them to be real. His father's hand found his shoulder, a familiar weight, the kind of grip that meant, "Stay close, we're not done here yet." And Neef fell into step beside him, phone sliding back into his pocket, the 17 tabs disappearing back into whatever part of himself he kept for later. That was when he caught her across the street. Willie D's daughter, Mercedes. He knew her, the way you know a storm system you've been warned about your whole life. Not by choice, but by necessity. The way you learn a threat's shape so you can see it coming. Except she didn't look like a storm right now. She looked like a girl standing very still at a funeral, the same as him, the same weight sitting on both their shoulders, even if it came from opposite houses. She was looking at him. Not the way people from Black Star usually looked at Diamond Mafia. Not with the flat, practiced hatred that came standard on both sides of Lincoln Avenue like a uniform. Just looking. Like she was cataloging him the same way he was cataloging her. Neef didn't know what made him hold her gaze, instead of looking away like he'd been trained to since he could walk. Maybe it was the funeral. Maybe it was that some part of him, the part that stayed up at 2 a.m. building things nobody asked him to build, was tired of only being able to see the world in the shape his father had handed him. Then somebody called Mercedes's name from across the street, and she turned, and the moment ended the way all their moments would end for a while yet, quietly, without incident. 2 people returning to their separate sides of the same avenue. Neef's father steered him toward the car. Behind them, the church doors closed, and Reverend Wallace was left alone in the sanctuary, same as he was after every funeral, gathering up the hymnals and thinking, not for the first time, that he had officiated more truces in that building than the 2 families would ever admit to needing. End of Chapter 1.